So this is video 3 of the 3 videos looking at the land management, land use planning structure for the province of Ontario. And this last video will be looking at local planning and how municipalities are taking the Planning Act, provincial policy statements, and provincial plans into consideration and integrating them into their local planning documents. So I'm going to be using City of Barrie as an example here, but I wanted to show you the general structure when we think about municipalities and how this might link into local planning. So we can have single tier or multi-tier municipalities. You should know that City of Barrie is a single tier, which means it acts on its own. There are many municipalities who also have multi-tiers. So there is an upper tier, which is normally, when you see the names, it is a county or region. And then the lower tiers operate within that broader upper tier structure. And those are lower tier municipalities. So when you think about a single tier, normally because these are larger municipalities, so City of Toronto is also a single tier, and they also normally have many of the services, infrastructure that they may be providing to their municipalities, they can do on their own. When we have an upper and lower tier, so the lower tiers are following a broader structure of the upper tier and the planning process. So within this area, we have Simcoe County, all right, and Town of Innisfil. And so Town of Innisfil falls under the planning structure of the county. You can also think if anybody's from Newmarket or Aurora, they fall within York Region. So York Region is the upper tier. It has a larger planning structure that then all of the lower tiers, lower tier municipalities, within York Region would be working under that larger regional planning framework. Okay, so as you are going out into your jobs and speaking with different municipalities, it is good to have a quick look at what sort of structure they have. Most municipalities will have that double tier process, and so it's good to have a handle on, are they an upper tier, are they a lower tier, and what sorts of services that might they provide. So when we're looking at the local planning process, a key thing that I want you to remember is that municipalities have 2 tools available to them to complete that local planning process. So one is the official plan. This is the policy document, so you can almost think of it like a local piece of legislation. It's forward thinking, just like the provincial planning direction. So we're looking at in the future, what sorts of growth, what sorts of development do we have to have, and how can we ensure that that is protective of our natural features and ecosystem functions. It must be consistent with and make sure that it does not conflict with the provincial policy statements set out by the Planning Act, and it needs to make sure that it is also conforming to any of those provincial guidance documents, the provincial plans. Okay, so we've already set that overall structure within the province, and now it's up to the municipalities to decide on their own how their own local planning might. The second tool that is available to municipalities are bylaws. So I want you to think of bylaws as almost like an instrument, okay? So they are able to use bylaws in order to do the approval component and the enforcement component. So those are the 2 tools that from a municipal planning, local planning perspective, we are seeing being used in order to control development, see how development may progress in the future, and to be more protective of our natural features and ecosystem functions. So I again wanted to show you what a land use planning map looks like. So the idea here is that we have created all of these policies, and it's meant to guide development and protection of those features. And so again, I showed a component of this as part of the first lecture slides, but this is showing for City of Barrie the official plan and land uses within our municipality based on that provincial direction. And so normally when people think the planning process, these are the sorts of things that they think about, that the outcome is this, and then within each of those areas we have some specific direction on the types of activities that can happen, the setbacks, how we are being protective of natural features within each of those different colors. So if you want to have an opportunity to look at the City of Barrie's official plan in more detail, I've included a link to that within these slides. One of the things that I want you to notice as you open that document, you can have a look, think about the first lecture video that I posted that was talking about the Planning Act and the components that must be included within the plan. And so that was in that section 16, subsection 1 that we reviewed of the Planning Act, where it indicated that all official plans, so for all municipalities, they have to outline what their goals, objectives, and policies will be in order to address all of these components, so social, economic, and the natural environment. And so if you have a look at the City of Barrie's official plan, you can see that they have incorporated some of those goals. So I'm showing you the example. Section 3.1 looks at growth management. And in here, you can have a look that as part of the growth management components that they're looking at, you can see that they're talking about some of the settlement areas that we discussed in the Places to Grow plan. All right, and looking at the diagram that you're seeing here is showing some of those key areas where development is meant to be directed, and so looking at the potential impact within that municipality. The other component, and so when you think about the official plan, it is quite long, but I wanted to show you how this particular local plan has taken into consideration some of the provincial policy requirements. And so we talked about provincial policy statements, and I've included a few examples in the first column on this table. So one of the components is that at a provincial scale, we are directing municipalities to all be planning based on the watershed, because that's the most ecologically meaningful unit. And so as you look within the City of Barrie's official plan, there are multiple sections that make reference to the watershed and ensuring that as they are planning within this municipality, that they use that particular unit of management. So I've given you a few references there. I've included a couple of other examples here. One of the purposes of having this provincial framework is to look at any cross-jurisdictional or cross-watershed impacts, and that we are collectively as municipalities looking at addressing that. And so I've included some references here about how City of Barrie will specifically do that. So I've included some section number references that you can have a look and get some more details. But I just want you to acknowledge that the provincial structure and framework that we have created has been consistently reflected in the municipal smaller scale planning, so you can see how the two are working together. And so that's where I want to leave off on the municipal side of things, is that the key piece here is each municipal planning document will be slightly different within their official plans, because each of those local jurisdictions have different types of natural features. They have different types of growth that need to be occurring within each of their municipalities. But using that provincial framework, we have some consistencies in the overall outcomes that we're hoping to achieve within each of the municipalities. So this slide, on slide 58, what I'm hoping to do is give you an overall summary of how that provincial scale planning helps to support the municipal role. And so as you work across those two columns, look within the rows about the connection that may be happening as well. Okay, so the role of the provincial government, think that they are creating that larger structure. So think about all of the components that helps to create that framework. They have provincial policy statements that help to set minimum standards and desired outcomes, but it gives the municipalities flexibility to then make local planning decisions. We have the provincial plans that look at specific provincial interests and features that we are trying to be protective of. And so we then are asking the municipalities to take into consideration all of these features and be preparing that within their local planning documents, which are the official plans. And I see I have a spelling error here. It should not be plays, it should be plans. And to be looking at how they can be making their local planning decisions to ensure that they are consistent with those provincial policy statements, and make sure that as they're taking into consideration the objectives of the provincial plans, that they also conform to those needs. The final key piece on the slide that I wanted to include was that municipalities then aren't on their own. So we are looking at these provincial framework, and that there is support and advice that can come from the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing to the municipalities, and so they can have that supporting role, that they can help interpretation on the provincial policy statements or the plans to look at how it may impact the features and functions within that municipal jurisdiction. So I wanted to shift gears a little bit, because part of when we look at any policy document, I think it's also good to look at some experiences and ideas that have come from other jurisdictions. And so this last segment is going to move us away from Ontario, and I'm actually going to show you a case study from New Orleans. The point of this next set of slides is to look that we don't need to recreate the wheel, that there is often lots of innovation in the activities that other jurisdictions are undertaking. And so we can use these lessons learned to help improve some of the policies and then activities that we are undertaking within our own jurisdiction. So as I said, I'm going to use New Orleans as a case study. New Orleans has been hit by many severe storm events, and so they have been hit very hard by flooding incidents, if you've been watching in the news. And lots of those flooding incidents aren't necessarily due to, although they've had lots of precipitation, the flooding has actually occurred because of insufficient storm sewer capacity. And so a very similar scenario when you look at some of the flooding that has happened in Ontario over the last few years, we have seen similar events. So Peterborough tends to be a good case study, that Peterborough has flooded over multiple years. And again, it's not necessarily because the streams are spilling their banks to a greater degree, but it's because we're not able to adequately deal with the stormwater within a specific area. And it's more of an infrastructure issue. So New Orleans is a great case study because they have developed what they call the Greater New Orleans Urban Water Plan. And this was to look at creating some policies that would help to support some new innovative land use planning within their area in order to create a city that's more livable, that their citizens won't be impacted by these flooding issues as much. And so hopefully they have a better water management strategy going forward. So there is a little video here that you can watch. So I encourage you to watch this. It's going to give some details on some of the plan components that are included and some of the background context on why they developed their plan. When you look at the issues that were happening within New Orleans, two components. So one was severe flooding because of these frequent storms, and the outcome of that there was lots of property and property damage, and then an economic impact as a result of this, which was hurting citizens. So from a financial standpoint, but also many people lost their homes during these severe storm events. The other component that went along with this is because of mismanagement of that stormwater, they were also experiencing subsidence. And so that's sinking of the ground. And as that ground shifts and changes, they were also seeing some infrastructure impact on buildings, on city streets and sidewalks where they had cracking and heaving. So that is certainly a safety concern for citizens, but there's also a huge cost to having to repair that infrastructure. So again, some experiences that we are also seeing in Ontario, and so a great opportunity to look at some of the solutions that New Orleans is including in their urban water plan. When you look at the overall objectives of the water plan, they have some very interesting strategies on how to address water. And the key piece is that this particular scenario of severe storm events means that we are going to continue to see the amount of water that we are getting in any given season. And so the city's approach needs to be different. And so in blue text, what you're seeing here is that the city is looking at multiple ways of addressing stormwater. So number one, they're looking at delaying the stormwater movement. So using things like bioretention ponds and infiltration strategies like rain gardens and bioswales in order to slow that particular water from moving from one location to the other. That gives the water time to infiltrate. It removes some of the contaminants from the water. And so overall, we are addressing the stormwater better. The second piece is looking at how they can better store that stormwater. And so when we have high periods of flooding within the city, is there an opportunity to move that water to a more appropriate space so that we aren't impacting our communities? So they really looked at within their cityscape, did they have opportunities to create some canals or ponding that we could direct that water to? And then the last point is a really interesting point and a shift in mindset, and thinking that traditionally we have thought of stormwater as a waste, and the shift in mindset is that we should actually be looking at it as a resource. All right. And so how can we be using it to enhance our communities and to connect our neighborhoods back to nature, that by storing it or using it in another way, it's an opportunity to see that as something, as a resource within our communities. So I'm going to show you a couple images of some of the ways that the municipality changed some of their landscapes. And as you look at these images, these are the final implementation. Within the urban water plan, the language within there, we are creating the structure, we are creating the policies that help guide development. And so New Orleans is slowly working towards these particular features, but the policies they have within the plan are helping to support to ensure that development happens in a certain way so that these features come to fruition. So the first image I'm going to show you, traditionally when we had flooding, what you would see is that if you look at the river on the left-hand side, that river would spill its banks, and you can see that there's a high level of development within that area. And so one of the opportunities within the planning process that they saw was that we could be diverting that water into other areas where it wouldn't have the same impact. And so they were looking at areas where there was open fields, existing wetlands, where they could be diverting that water. And so if you watch the video, you can actually see an animation of this, but the idea was that when you see these several ponds in the center of the screen here, those ponds would fill up first, but they were looking at other areas. So there's a community center and an open field here beside that community center that, based on some new infrastructure, they could actually divert the water into that field. Although it may disrupt activities on the field, there's no infrastructure necessarily that it's going to impact. As water levels go down, that water could then infiltrate within those vegetated areas. And again, so not having the same impact as it may if it floods into a residential community. Here's another drawing. So this is looking at along that riverbank as well, and looking at reconfiguring those urban pathways along the river, again, to support the river spilling its banks, which is a natural function that we should be allowing our rivers to do. It allows nutrients to be restored to the landscape and ensures that those floodwaters aren't impacting our communities. And so part of the redevelopment process is to be ensuring that we are protective of those lands beside the waterway, but also trying to create some new patterns in that development so that if the banks spill, they're spilling towards the right side on the screen, where it gives the opportunity to allow it to spill into areas that aren't developed, but also allows that infiltration capacity because it's already vegetated. The last image that I'm going to show you shows so some other areas when we look at flooding and we think about an urbanized area, that flooding is happening because the water has nowhere to go. And so traditionally within an urban landscape, we have lots of impervious surfaces. And so one of the things that the city of New Orleans is looking at is to create some very specific policies that as new buildings are developed or as we retrofit existing buildings, that we can be looking at some greenscaping along with those that either new development or retrofit. And part of that can be including some green roofs. So if you look closely at this image, you should see multiple buildings that have those green roofs. So this gives an opportunity to store water in some cases. It's slowing the water down, and it does give the opportunity to remove some of the contaminants that may be in some of that stormwater. So where we don't have the opportunity maybe for natural spaces, we can be using our built infrastructure and some of the additional planning that can go into that to ensure that we are addressing those initial components of diverting and storing in order to slow down that movement of stormwater. So this next slide, what I wanted to show you, and it's a bit of a quote from those who took the lead on the urban water plan, is to think about how we share these actions. And so I'll just read the quote for you. So good ideas do not turn into meaningful actions by themselves. They require a supporting framework of guiding policies, legal jurisdiction, program authorizations, and funding. And so think about our discussions about multiple policy tools and ways that we can be implementing actions. And I think this shows a really good connection between those, that certainly we need some of the legal requirements and policies, but there's lots of on the ground components that we can be taking into consideration, that individual programs can be working together. And so you see here we have public infrastructure, we've got stormwater and groundwater management units working together. And to ensure that these sorts of things are implemented, we can be looking at supporting that with some funding to ensure that things actually happen on the ground. All right, so lots of interconnections on how we can move from policy into action and some of the supporting criteria that we need to have to help do that. So again, when you have a look through the urban water plan, and I'm not expecting that you memorize components, but I want you to understand the overall nature of that. You will see that the policies set out there are looking at setting some anticipated outcomes and identifying specific areas where actions can actually happen. So I did want to show you a few examples of those policies. And so this is some direction. If you think from the planning structure that we just looked at in Ontario, they're looking within the greater New Orleans area on how we can be directing some of this stormwater management development. And so one of the things that they've included is that the city departments in their own water, stormwater management best practices will be incorporating some of the key strategies and components in the design and construction of their public projects. So think about some of the green spaces that they're incorporating, ensuring that there's connection between those green spaces and ensuring that we are delaying and slowing down and storing some of the stormwater that's happening. It's also looking at blue-green infrastructure. So this is very similar to, we talk about green infrastructure in Ontario. So that's our trees and looking at things like wetlands and their ability to help support achieving some of those slowing and infiltrating of stormwater. And so looking at ensuring that as any new development, so they talk about construction permits, that they would be giving incentives or so the non-compliance fees can be some enforcement requirements if those new construction projects aren't inclusive of some of these green infrastructure best practices. So oftentimes when you see green infrastructure, if it's not already there, what we're talking about is creating some new ones. And so in Ontario, the language we often use is a low impact development. And so I'm sure you've seen many examples of that. So just a final slide. I want you to take away from this New Orleans example that we can be looking at a policy review in other jurisdictions, and that by reviewing those policies, it really helps us to understand maybe some new innovations or best practices, lessons learned that we can take away from similar jurisdictions, and they can certainly help support us in our local implementation. So let's learn from each other and take into consideration some of these new policy innovations, and it can help to support our better local environment. So there are some questions within this particular lecture. Make sure you are also using the discussion forums available as you're trying to answer these questions. And if there are specific questions, you can always email me as well. So that's the end of the three-part lecture explanation. The actual PowerPoint slides are also posted to help support you in your understanding. Thank you.